Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about floodplain violations and enforcement. And I'm Ceil Strauss. I'm the state floodplain manager, and I'll be assisted on the logistics by my coworker, Gary Bennett. So thanks, Gary. Let's get into it. I'm going to turn off my camera and save a little bandwidth here. We'll get into the meat of what we're talking about today, which is floodplain enforcement in dealing with violations. We'll talk about some of the actual regulations at the state and federal level and steps that communities typically do take and can take to verify that regulations are being followed. And we'll talk about what is a violation, some steps to address those. In a couple of these places, we're going to have a lot of overlap with our presentation we do on Floodplain Administration 101, because a big part of the steps to prevent violations or address violations really is a big part of what you do in the administration of that ordinance and issuing the permits. We will talk toward the end about what are the repercussions if a community doesn't enforce the ordinance, and a system that FEMA and that the state has access to where they're identifying potential violations in a FEMA database. So starting off with the actual requirements, the federal code, the 44 CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, is where the applicable federal regulations are for floodplain management. And one of the key definitions here is what's a violation. And it means that it's written out here that it's when the structure or other development is not fully compliant with the community's floodplain management regulations. So that includes that if they don't have the elevation certificates or other evidence of compliance that they've built in compliance with that permit and with your ordinance. And a reminder that sometimes folks think, well, as long as they're meeting the FEMA requirements, it's okay. But FEMA reminds us that communities, if they have higher standards, they have more restrictive standards, they are expected to enforce those rules that are in their ordinance. Your ordinance is the law in your community. And there is wording in the Code of Federal Regulations here that if there are higher standards adopted by the state, and Minnesota has many higher standards, or your community, if you adopt things that are higher standards than our state minimums, that whichever's more restrictive is what takes precedence. And that's, again, that's in the federal code. And there's another part in the federal code, I guess I don't have that quoted here, but that the higher standards are encouraged in the federal standard. So high level, what is required? That you're going to require permits for development in the FEMA mapped floodplain and in adjacent areas that are below the base flood elevation, the 100-year floodplain. You're going to determine whether that proposal meets your ordinance standards. You're going to issue a permit with a requirement that as-built documentation is submitted. You'll do appropriate inspections and get that as-built documentation, and you'll enforce your ordinance. And that's part of what communities agreed to when they get enrolled in the National Flood Insurance Program. So what development needs a permit? And that, again, comes right from the federal code there. It says that we must require permits for all proposed construction or other development within the Zone A. So any of the 1% annual chance flood plains or the 100-year floodplain. And the definition of development is very broad. It goes beyond buildings and maybe main roadway crossings and those kinds of things. It's any man-made change to the improved or unimproved real estate. So in addition to buildings, that includes other types of structures, mining, dredging, filling, grading, paving, all kinds of different things. Basically any change to the cross section in that floodplain. And when we talk about permits, if it's a building and you have building code, then you're going to issue a building permit. But if it's not something where you would issue a building permit, you might call it a zoning permit or land alteration permit or floodplain permit, and any of those work. But one thing that some communities might do is consider waiving fees or having reduced fees if it's something that wouldn't have required a permit normally. After they submit that permit application, you're going to verify that proposal meets the ordinance, and then you're going to issue that permit. And we do need to require as-built documentation. And here's the reference in the federal code where it says that communities must maintain a record of that lowest floor and any flood proofing. So that's in federal code, and they emphasize in their trainings that those records must be retained indefinitely. And we basically say, as long as that building exists, you should be keeping that on file. And unfortunately, we have come across communities where they cleaned house, they got rid of old stuff or anything that was older than 5 years. And you do need to hang on to these things. Our buildings last for 50, 60, 70, even 100 years. So we want to retain those records. In the state rules, we have similar language that you must have that documentation. We do have this wording here that says if we're looking at a building and we need a survey, that it could be completed by a licensed surveyor, a professional engineer, or other qualified person designated by the local governing body. And in your ordinance, you're going to have similar wording to this in your local ordinance. So there's a little bit of flexibility on whether they have to be a licensed surveyor. There's certainly others that are qualified. They do a good job doing surveys, but aren't necessarily licensed. So there is that flexibility. But we'll mention later that there are times when if they're applying for a way to get their FEMA zone changed, or if they need an elevation certificate, an official FEMA elevation certificate, then they do have to have it signed by that licensed land surveyor or the professional engineer. And our more flexible wording that's in state law won't work in those situations. A few things that FEMA, in order to approve your ordinances and in order for the state to give our final approval, there are a few of these phrases that are required to be in your ordinance. So they should be in your ordinances unless it's a really old ordinance and not up to date with our current standards. But they want this abrogation and greater restriction. Basically that if there's conflicts between the floodplain ordinance and other parts of your zoning, that whichever's more restrictive shall apply. And the severability language, that if something is determined to be unconstitutional or invalid by the court, the remainder of the ordinance shall not be affected. So, and we've got the wording in our model ordinance, and when we provide the sample ordinances, we have that included in what communities are adopting. They also want to make sure that you do have the enforcement provisions in your ordinance. And again, we'll have that in our sample ordinance, but that's something that sometimes communities, when they are just picking parts of the model and they're trying to insert it into their existing ordinance, those are things we have to make sure that they're in there. And particularly when you're not adopting our whole model ordinance, those are things that we have to make sure are in there. The ordinance in Minnesota law has to be properly adopted. And when DNR is reviewing and approving your ordinances, and which, by the way, DNR is required to to give you final approval and verify that your ordinance meets state and federal requirements. But in order to properly adopt, we've got these rules in Minnesota statutes that you need to have at least a 10-day notice in your local newspaper, and at the same time you're sending that notice to DNR and I'm sure many others. But one thing is that we do prefer it be sent electronically. The language in old ordinances will say you send it to the commissioner, and we prefer it not be mailed to our DNR commissioner or even to us, because that does delay things if they get mailed. Our state requirements that we have our public hearing, and DNR tries to give conditional approval before you have that public hearing. We like to get your draft ordinance so we can do the review and make sure that anything that needs to be added, that's required language, that we get it in there certainly before you have your hearing. Then you have your adoption. We'll be looking for that notice in the paper afterwards. You're required by statute to either run the whole ordinance in the paper, or you can do a summary notice. And certainly, usually communities are going to prefer to do the summary because that's going to be cheaper. And then DNR gives the final approval and we share it with FEMA, and they do a separate review. This next section, when we're talking about what you're doing to basically the steps that you need to take to enforce the ordinance, a lot of this will overlap with some of what we talk about in our Floodplain Administration 101, but we'll go through it a little more quickly here. So in the typical permitting process, the same main steps I was mentioning earlier, you're looking at, is it in the floodplain? What district is it in? Does it meet your ordinance? Is their application meeting those standards? And doing inspections and getting that as-built documentation. So the first step is it in your floodplain? And for most of you, you're regulating that 1% annual chance floodplain. This is on the older paper maps that some of you still have. In a few communities are regulating the 500-year, which is this medium risk area. And the area that's not filled in is the lower risk area. And some communities have some higher standards and some additional zones that they regulate, which is great. When you noted some of those other high risk areas that based on the relative elevations of areas, are they areas that if we have a big rain, are you going to have ponding there? Do you have stormwater ponds? Those kinds of areas. If you've got some higher standards, that's great. As we'll talk about in other trainings, we focus on, especially this floodway area, we're going to be more restrictive here. There are, for the most part, new buildings at least, are not allowed in the floodway, and expansions of existing buildings are not allowed in the floodway. We're going to be really restrictive here. The flood fringe area, the rest of that floodplain, is where most kinds of development can occur. Your underlying zoning is going to say what kinds of things you allow in your community. There's that flood fringe label. On the newer maps, this is the coloring you'll see, the floodway, that red and blue hatching, and the light blue for the flood fringe. That medium risk area, which is usually the 500-year, will be this orangish brown color. And again, we regulate the floodway much more stringently, and the flood fringe will have our standards that we talk about. When there is a detailed study, FEMA will have calculated other frequencies. They may have calculated the 10-year, the 50-year, 100-year, and 500-year, or in newer counties, they're also calculating the 25-year in something called the 100-year plus. Our minimum regulated area is that 100-year or the 1% annual chance floodplain. And again, some communities do regulate in the 500-year. And based on what we're hearing about future changes, possible future regulations, it appears that we'd be looking at regulating within the 500-year floodplain if that is mapped. If you've heard our presentations on the ASCE 24-24, that's a document that the building code folks use, and it's something that we're being encouraged to get the word out about and encourage communities to adopt some higher standards based on that ASCE 24-24. And we did have a separate training about, or presentation about that in one of our monthly LGU forums that we do, and do have that recording available on our website. The terminology that we're using, and I've already been using a lot of these terms, that 1% annual chance flood, the 100-year flood, base flood elevation is something FEMA will use, or will use when we're talking about minimum requirements. In state law, we refer to the regional flood. And if we're talking with insurance agents or lenders, they'll be calling it the special flood hazard area. And basically, these all mean the same thing, that 100-year floodplain, or that high flood risk area that we're regulating. FEMA requires that any of the FEMA mapped areas are regulated by your ordinance. And the way your ordinance is set up, it says this ordinance applies to all these mapped areas. And then we also have some state law that says the area adjacent to the FEMA mapped areas, if it's below the flood elevation, is also regulated by your ordinance. So for instance, in this site here, we can see from the elevation contours is actually a high site. So officially you're still regulating that because it's in the FEMA mapped area. But well, in this example, they could still put a basement and be meeting minimum elevations because they're so high. But our state law recognized that, like in this example, that the FEMA boundaries were not perfect. And many of our counties, unfortunately, still do have the floodplain boundaries that do not match the actual ground elevations very well. Over time, this won't be a big deal because our floodplain boundaries will be following the contours better. But for now, keep that in mind if you're in one of those counties where the FEMA boundaries don't follow the elevation contours very well. And the language in our sample ordinance is here in section 3, and it talks about where there's that conflict that you will regulate that area that's below the base flood elevation adjacent to the floodplain there, the map floodplain. We're using the FEMA maps, and in some cases they're that old paper map, the flood insurance study in detailed study areas. Some of the older ones from before 1988 actually have 2 maps that go with them, a flood insurance rate map and a floodway map. The newer paper maps and the digital maps all have a flood insurance rate map. The newer studies will look more like this instead of having this graphic on them. They have this look here with the state and where the county is that has that newer map. And the panels will look a little bit different here. They'll have that more modern coloring. The newer ones will have a color digital background or aerial photo background. Some of the first earlier new ones had more of a black and white aerial background. And those we were showing some of the detailed study areas, but much of the state, we don't have detailed studies. We have zone A, where it's showing that 100-year floodplain, that 1% annual chance floodplain, but there's no E and there's no elevations on the FEMA maps. We do have mapping, supporting mapping, modeling, and we've got our cross sections in our DNR viewer, our lake and flood elevations online. And then we do have the 1% elevations on those lines. So we figured out which district it's in. Either it's going to be the floodway district, the flood fringe district, if it's detailed study, or in your ordinance, we referred to the areas with A zones, as the general floodplain. That's also the district in some cases will have detailed studies that don't have a floodway identified, and you'll be looking in your general floodplain area in your ordinance. You're going to look at your ordinance, see what standards apply for the proposal that they've got, and do the review. And we do have two forms of a possible application form. You don't have to use this, but we do make this available as a Word document. So you can either use the full version that we've got as a recommended permit application, or you can put your name on it and take the parts that are helpful for your community and add what other local requirements you have. But we do have links to both versions. This is the simplified version that you would use if they're doing maybe decks or fences or tanks or just earth moving of some kind. And then we do have the building version that gets into more details that you need to look at if they're putting in a building. So one of the things that you need to look at in all the zones is documenting, is it in the floodplain? Is it in the area you're regulating? If so, is it the floodway, the flood fringe, or the general floodplain? Is it a permitted use, or is it an option that is permitted if they get a conditional use permit? And we've got a place here to be calculating what is your flood elevation, what's your regulatory flood protection elevation, which is that lowest floor for buildings. And also we'll use that regulatory flood protection elevation for flood proofing and determining what modeling we need to do to see if it's going to impact flood elevations in the area. And if you've got older maps, it's going to be in the NGVD 29 datum. If you've got newer maps, the information will be in the newer NAVD 1988 datum. Sometimes you have local datum. So it's important that you're noting what datum you're working in, especially if you're up in the northwest part of the state where that can be over a foot different. And a place to note, where did you get the information from? Was it from that flood insurance rate map and the flood insurance study? Was it based on maybe our supporting 1% annual chance flood cross sections that we have on our lake and flood elevations online site, or some other source, like maybe you reached out to DNR or got a Corps of Engineers study or something like that? But we especially need to know that flood protection elevation for structures and buildings, knowing that minimum floor elevation and how high floodproofing needs to go if it's something that can be floodproofed. Again, on that sample form that we've got on our website, we have a place to note what are the required elevations according to your ordinance, and then look at what are they proposing. And again, making sure that you're talking apples and apples, that if you've got the requirements here in 29 datum, make sure that you're looking at what the 29 datum would be for what your proposed elevations are. And we've also got a spot to note that, are they all at or above the required elevations, yes or no? Or if it's something that you're looking at floodproofing, is it showing that the floodproofing is occurring in the area it needs to? So we're trying to step through making sure that their application is meeting your ordinance. The trying to avoid problems from the beginning is the best way to be enforcing your ordinance and making sure that they're following the rules. We do allow those small accessory structures to be wet flood proofed. And in our most recent ordinance, sample ordinance, we say that's up to 600 square feet, because FEMA came out with some accessory and egg structure guidance a few years ago and said that we can use up to 600 square feet. Our older model ordinance and many of your ordinances use 576 square feet, a 24 by 24 building, Or if you have a really old ordinance, you might just have 500 square feet in there. But that allows flood-resistant materials, elevated utilities. It's got to be properly anchored, and it does require the flood openings that are within a foot of the ground.
Ceil, if I can interrupt, we did have a question
Sure.
in the chat if we have time. They're basically just asking about roads and sidewalks, whether or not they need to be elevated to the base flood elevation.
Roads and sidewalks. Well, sidewalks, we don't have anything that specifically talks about that. The roads gets a little more complicated because it depends on if it's a major road. We've got wording in our subdivision language and in the public utilities and road section of the ordinance, like a main highway, a main collector road. It does need to be elevated. Let's see, help me remember, Gary. I believe it's to the RFPE.
For major transportation routes.
Right. And then in the subdivision language, it's got language saying that your egress, that you've got to have the roads. That one says that doesn't have this clearer language, but we're going to be looking at similar concerns about having at least one of the roads in there that is higher. And then many communities will have something that's a higher standard. It's not actually in state law, that the driveways or access to new buildings be no lower than a foot below the base flood elevation. Basically, they came up with that recommendation so that emergency vehicles that could maybe drive through a foot of water could get there as water levels are coming up and down. But that is something that it does depend on what's the use of that road. But definitely our main roads and having the main access to new subdivisions, we do have requirements that the roads are at a higher elevation. And if you've got multiple access points, just one of them has to be at that elevation. The others could be lower. Oh, back to this, talking about these flood openings. And the requirement is that those are no more than a foot above the ground or a foot above the floor of the building. And the idea there is to allow the equalizing of the water so that you don't get water building up on the outside of a wall, that if you have the opening, then the pressure is coming from both sides, and that will be more stable. If you don't have openings, you get the blowouts. And this is a picture that we had many pictures like this in like the 1997 flood and other big floods, where there were a lot of older buildings where we had basements or crawl spaces, and the water built up and put a lot of pressure on that building, and it wasn't designed for water to be up against that foundation. Within a foot of the ground or the floor, if the floor is a little higher, and that for every square foot that's enclosed, you need a square inch of net opening. So if we have our 600 square foot garage, then we need 600 square inches of opening there. And this is one of those enforcement things, is making sure that that is automatically opening, that they're not covering these up. And if you're out inspecting, verifying that that is a functioning opening, that they have that there. And they need to be on at least two sides of the structure, especially in areas with any kind of flow. That requirements is because you could have this get blocked on one side, and we want at least one side where the flow would still be able to go in and out of the building. Here's some automatic openings that have been engineered, and those are nice ones, especially if you want insulated areas. And they've got a certification with them saying this particular opening, this model is the equivalent of 200 square inches or 215 square inches or 225 square inches are some typical certifications you'll see. If you do have an existing non-conforming structure, those do get more complicated. So we do have some areas in our sample permit application to look at those non-conforming structures. And we have to look at, will the cost of that proposed improvement or repair, what is that cost that we would expect it to be based on like a contractor's estimate or other estimates that take the full cost, not saying I'm going to do this myself, but looking at what it would cost a contractor to do. Look at that compared to the market value of the building by itself, not including the land value. And if it's more than 50%, then it is substantial improvement, and they need to bring it into compliance. So if they're trying to do it and not bring the whole building into compliance, they have to stay under that 50%. And we do have a separate training that we gave recently on substantial damage determinations and your role after a flood. And we get into some more detail on the substantial damage determinations. And we talk a little bit about cumulative improvement. But here, the minimum requirement is that you're looking at the improvements that they're proposing right now, and then any recent repairs and maintenance. And in our model ordinance, we use a 365-day look back, because sometimes it's not clear when a project started and when it ended. So the minimum requirement is that you're looking at the proposed improvement now and any maintenance and repairs done within the previous year. Some communities do have a cumulative improvement requirement in your ordinance. And so there, it might be from the date of your first ordinance. I think we're starting to see more interest in maybe a 10-year rolling or 20-year rolling, but you'd look at any of the improvements over time. And we do have a place to do those calculations in our model application form. And I mentioned the substantial damage that we just gave a training on that more recently. Reminder that we do have our post-flood substantial damage playbook for local officials. And this really steps through a lot of the details you would need to know for determining if something's been substantially damaged. But just at a very high level, substantial damage can occur from flooding, from any kind of event, fire, tornadoes. If it's impacts a building in your map floodplain, you're looking at whether it was substantially damaged. And if it was, then they need to be brought into compliance with that current ordinance and elevate, maybe fill in a basement, those kinds of things. And if you do have a big event, then you'll be looking at bigger permitting and the efforts to do the substantial damage determinations. DNR will help as much as we can, and in bigger events, traditionally FEMA's been able to come in and help with some of these determinations. And depending on if there's a federal declaration or not, sometimes there's funding available to help pay to bring on extra help in doing those determinations and the permitting after a flood or other events. A reminder that if something is happening in the floodway, they can't put buildings there, but if they're doing like a road crossing or grading for a trail or grading for a driveway or a parking lot or something like that, if it's going through a floodway, that they must get a certification of no rise, show that that filling will not obstruct the flow, will not cause an increase in flood elevations for anybody else. And that normally is completed by an engineer. Sometimes we can satisfy that with some other engineering practices. For example, if we can find proof of what the previous grade was and maybe it was eroded and they're just showing that they're going back to what was there before, then we've got the form, and we're actually working on a new version of this form. We realized that we put that out there in 2004, and we're going to have a fillable PDF and a little bit more user-friendly form to fill out here in the near future. But if they can't show that, if it will cause an increase, they've got to go through FEMA's conditional letter of map revision process. And that is not an easy process, and people will want to avoid that. So we do have a place on our form to look at the developments in the floodway, and is it a type of development that's allowed there? And yeah, if it's a road or grading for something like that, that is allowed. But if it's a building, no, it's not going to be allowed. And then how did they determine that it meets that no rise requirement? Was it done with an analysis by a professional engineer, or was it one of the other accepted engineering practices that we can use? So we try and step through the things that you need to remember in going through that review. And then at the end of our sample application form, we've got a place to note that it was approved. We'll have to have a conditional use permit hearing. We need some additional information, or it's a flat out, we can't accept this. They're asking to put a building in a floodway, and we can't allow that. Oh, and for developments in the general floodplain where we don't have a floodway, we have the allowable rise that needs to be documented. So similar, and that's another form we're going to have in the near future here, is an allowable rise form. But whether that was done by a professional engineer or we use one of the other methods that we can use to determine if it's in the floodway or flood fringe. And an example would be if it's adjacent to a lake that's not a flowing system, that if it's above the ordinary high, we usually say that can be treated as flood fringe. Just based on it being above that ordinary high. And we do get into more details on determining that allowable rise in our training that we did earlier this year, dealing with A zones, and some of the other techniques that you can use to determine whether it's floodway or flood fringe without them having to do modeling and have that engineer do that updated modeling. We do talk about that in our Minnesota Quick Guide, and I think we'll have a link to that at the end of the training here today. But talking about that, they do need to figure out if they're in a floodway, flood fringe, and the allowable rise is what we call that analysis. If it's not a detailed study, we still need to make sure that any rise that is caused is less than half a foot. And if there's any existing buildings, that you need to make sure any increase doesn't touch those existing buildings. And if there are existing buildings right next to the floodplain, they can't cause a rise. Reminder of the community's responsibility after you look at new permitted activities and making sure they're following the rules. That's your best line to make sure that you're following your ordinance, you don't have violations. The next most common situation we see is people have applied for what's called a letter of map revision based on fill. If the building is in or touching a floodplain and someone has a federally backed loan, that lender must require that person to get flood insurance. And if they're on a naturally high area, they can apply for a letter of map amendment, and they get a flood insurance, mandatory flood insurance waiver, or they can bring in fill, elevate that building, meeting your ordinance, and then apply to FEMA for that letter of map revision based on fill. So it's another way to get the insurance waiver from that mandatory flood insurance requirement. But when there's fill involved, they have to have a community acknowledgement form that's filled out by you at the community level. And when you're signing that, you're verifying their lowest floor will meet the regulatory flood protection elevation in your ordinance, or if it's a proposed building, that it's proposed to meet that minimum elevation, and that the lowest adjacent grade is at the base flood elevation or above.
I can try to take over. And Ceil, please help me out if I miss something here. So letters of map revision based on fill. So these are those situations where you've got a property that's, typically would be below that base flood elevation, but they're going to bring in some fill. They're going to elevate to the BFE to meet the federal requirement. In many cases, they're going to elevate to that regulatory flood protection elevation to meet the state requirement, and then they're going to build their home. So as this slide says, and I've encountered a number of these Lomer Fs are common violations. Oftentimes, what I've identified is they'll meet the federal requirement. They'll elevate to the base flood elevation, but they aren't necessarily bringing the top of the lowest floor to meet the state requirement, which is that regulatory flood protection elevation.
Yeah, sorry there, Gary. But the other point that I was trying to make in that slide is that it used to ask for the lowest floor elevation in the old form. And then that got changed in 2001 when they came out with this technical bulletin 10-1. And then they started allowing some alternative elevation methods where they could fill if they met this technical bulletin 10 standard. But that's when they started requiring the community acknowledgement form to be filled out when there's filling. And when you're signing that, you're making sure that they are not in the floodway, have all the necessary permits or will get them, and that they say that it has to be reasonably safe from flooding. And what that means is that it either is meeting your ordinance and meeting that minimum elevation, or it's meeting some specific requirements in the technical bulletin 10. So moving on, talking about inspections and as-built documentation here. One of the best ways to document that is with an elevation certificate, the FEMA elevation certificate. And if you're in a community rating system, you must use that. And if they want to use it to get a little cheaper flood insurance premium, they have to use the elevation certificate. We do have this sample elevation as built that includes some of the state requirements that aren't in the FEMA requirements, like this lowest fill going out 15 feet from the building. There are some cases where LiDAR can be used when it's really obvious that they're really high, like this example here. And for small sheds where they're just doing that wet flood proofing, you might just use photos and the LiDAR, because you'll know that the lowest floor is at least at that elevation. And if they're using their flood resistant materials, then you don't necessarily need an elevation certificate. We did do an article on using the LiDAR a few years ago in our water talk. So what's a violation? That not getting a permit, and typical reaction after would be the LGU realizes that they did something. Maybe your assessor's office advised you that there's a building there that wasn't there before. And then you're going to look at an after the fact permit. You're typically going to charge a higher fee, but you're seeing if they had come through the process, would they be meeting your ordinance, or do they need to change something after the fact? And if work started without a permit, you're normally going to advise them to stop. And if they don't listen to your verbal request to stop, that you issue that formal stop work order. And if they're not building in compliance with the permit, again, advising them to correct. And you might need to go through that formal stop work order. And if you've got building code, then you can be withholding the certificate of occupancy. And same thing with if they don't submit as-built documentation, you can be withholding that certificate of occupancy if you've got building code, or escrow. And that's something that I know some of our counties that don't have building code, that they collect an escrow up front, or cities that don't have building code, they collect an escrow that will basically cover what the cost would be for the community to hire a local surveyor to go out there and get that survey. So then once they've submitted that as-built survey, they get their escrow back. That's something, if you don't do that now, we could point you toward a couple communities that do that, if you want to be able to talk with a fellow community and see how that works. So usually you're going to start off with verbal, phone call or email reminders, and maybe you do that and send a formal letter at the same time. You're looking at those, again, the after the fact permits, that they're having them go through the process that they should have, formal stop work orders, these other things we had mentioned. And as a last resort, you're usually looking at certainly a last resort for going to court and getting a court decision. And if you've taken all the steps you've got legally available in your community, another option is that communities can request that FEMA put them on their Section 1316 list, which is basically blackballing them and saying that that property can't get flood insurance in the future. So it may not impact the current owner, but it would impact them being able to sell it to someone else. And I'm sure that you guys have some other ideas of what works in your communities. So what happens if it isn't properly enforced? There are a few things that the state and FEMA will be looking at. We'll do what FEMA is calling an audit, and we call more community check-ins or visits, that if we do suspect a lot of violations or that there's some pattern of violations, we'll set up what's called a community assistance visit. We do that sometimes with communities that have a lot of policies, or they're looking at getting in the community rating system. It's just because we do a community assistance visit doesn't always mean that you're doing things wrong, but that is what the process would be if we see a pattern of some non-compliance with the floodplain regulations. If you're a community that's in the community rating system, then you can have your class downgraded, which you don't want to do. And then if we've been working with a community and they're not making corrections in their process, they're not dealing with those violations that have been found, then we work with FEMA to get that community put on probation. And basically there's a surcharge if there's flood insurance policies, and they're put on notice. And then if they continue to have problems, then FEMA will suspend the community from the National Flood Insurance Program. And that means no flood insurance available in the community. They're not eligible for a lot of the post-disaster assistance or some of the grants. You can also be suspended if you don't adopt your new ordinance within 6 months of getting a letter from FEMA saying, we're going to have new maps in 6 months. Wanted to spend the last few minutes talking about a listing that FEMA keeps and the state has access to, and we can also add to. But FEMA's got something called the violation tracker, and there's 4 categories of violations that go into this relatively recent tracker. They really started developing this just a few years ago. So if there were problems, violations noted during one of these audits, during a community assistant contact or community assistant visit, those could have gone into the system, into that database. Or if someone's applying for a letter of map amendment or letter of map revision based on fill, or the bigger letters of map revisions that are actually changing the map, then sometimes FEMA will see violations and they'll send a letter to the community and say, hey, they applied for a Lomer F, and we see that there appears to be a violation here. And when that happens, the community will work with FEMA and the state. Usually we get notified after the fact when those letters go to you, but we then try and figure out if it's a violation that can be corrected, or what the options are for that situation. The other situation is like we were talking about, where they applied for a Lomer F and they didn't actually meet the minimum elevations, and FEMA could tell in the application form. And we also review them, even if they got issued. Gary usually reaches out to the communities when we get our monthly batch of LOMAs and LOMA Fs. And if it was a fill situation, we're verifying that you have the documentation that that lowest floor met the minimum requirements. Community rating system communities have additional check-ins and reviews by FEMA contractors. And if there are violations identified in that system, that would end up in this database. But most of the violations in this database were from before the current way that FEMA's doing premiums. And they found that they were post-firm flood. So they were buildings built after the first maps, and the lowest floor was below the flood elevation. They also called those minus rated policies. So there'll be those in that database. And so it's FEMA's National Violation Tracker is what I'm talking about, this database is. And so they put things that FEMA has identified from those 4 sources go into this database. And the state can also add violations that we find into the database. But again, most of them were these old minus rated. The more recent ones that they're finding usually come from a letter of map amendment or revision request. I can share address label level data if I get an information sharing access agreement, and they did actually make a form that I can send and share the violations in a way that is much more streamlined now. And this is what it looks like in the database. So it'll say the kind of violation it is, whether it's been mitigated or not, and the typical kinds of violations that they list in here. Well, these are the ones that they list. The most common that we see in here is low floors, but also fill in the floodway where there wasn't proof of that, them meeting that allowable rise or the no rise requirements. So for CRS communities in particular, this is a concern because if they're in this database, in this National Violation Tracker, that feeds a system that says they cannot get the insurance discount that community rating system communities get. So I saw City of Austin was on the call here today. They're a class 5, so people get a 25% discount on their flood insurance policies in Austin and in Moorhead and some other communities that are in that community rating system. So if they are shown as having a violation, they don't get that discount. One problem was that they weren't telling people why they weren't getting the discount for a while, but I think that that's been improved in the FEMA process now. So here's what the form looks like, and there is a place for us to go in and say it's been mitigated, and the mitigation choices would be it's been mitigated to meet those federal requirements, or it's been mitigated to meet the higher state requirements. It's been mitigated to the maximum extent possible, which doesn't mean it was fully mitigated, or the building's not there, or we realize that it wasn't actually a violation. And there actually were quite a few in there that really weren't a violation. A variance been issued, or it's just plain no, it hasn't been mitigated. If it's one of these green ones, it's been mitigated to meet those requirements, or the building's not there, or really wasn't a violation, then it gets taken off that community rating system discount exclusion list, the list that they don't get the CRS discount because they're a violation. So that was what we wanted to talk about today. And I want to say thanks to everyone for attending today. I hope that it was helpful information. We appreciate folks coming,